Look, yeah, so through the various presentations, there was a lot of talk about how you might go about undertaking frog surveys. And so, hold on, I've got various things popping up on the screen here. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of frog monitoring 101 to help people think about how they might use FrogID to sort of maximise the value of the results that are coming in and maximise your experience with the app. And so just a few little things that'll help fine-tune your approach to using FrogID and getting the best results. So definitely use FrogID. That's really critical. And I think that's the great thing about FrogID is you're generating really robust data that's contributing to Sloan's Champions and contributing to all this other amazing broader work that Jody talked about. But it's also a great tool to help you learn the different species and learn about the local frog fauna. So it's not just a recording device. It's actually also a really fantastic education device that you can use here, but not only just here, but anywhere that you go in Australia and learn about the frog fauna. You know, we're keen to have people visit wetlands. You know, Helen talked a lot about multiple visits to the same wetlands. And so frogs, they don't necessarily always call at all the time, and they certainly vary in when they call across different seasons. We talked a little bit earlier about how Sloan's seems to be a really winter specialist calling species. And, you know, just how important that is for our understanding of local frog fauna and biodiversity in general is, you know, we've, until we sort of became more aware of the situation with Sloan's and we're paying more attention to it, there were various biodiversity assessments undertaken in the region, and they typically looked at frogs come the start of spring and a bit later into spring. And what we found is that all these biodiversity assessments actually missed what is probably the most important species in this area, which is Sloan's. And so having a better understanding, which largely came through Alex Knight's PhD work of when Sloan's is primarily calling, has allowed us to then target our efforts and get better information. Sloan's is great in that they can call any time of the day, but we do generally find that they are at their peak calling activity in those few hours after dark. But look, honestly, even a still sunny day when it's pleasant to walk around wetlands and parks and wherever else, you often get Sloan's calling through the day. So, so yeah, use FrogID at any time. Surveying for frogs, we're reliant on, well, using this method, we're reliant on hearing them calling. And so things like when it's windy, if the wind is noisy or if the rain is noisy, then it can become less clear hearing the species. But also if you're making recordings for some, you know, it's good to have good conditions for the calling, because it makes it a lot easier for Jody's team and herself, who are listening to all these thousands of recordings that are coming in. And one thing that Helen and I have been doing as part of this program is we married up with the Woolshed Thurgoona Landcare Group, and we've put a bit of information about surveying for frogs, in particular the Sloan's Champions project, on that website. So visit that website for a bit more information on the Sloan's Champions survey methodology. So just also be mindful of procedures that will keep you safe and also keep others happy and safe. So be mindful if you're accessing or approaching private property, particularly if you're doing it at night. Being someone who's spent the last few decades spending a lot of time creeping around the landscape at night, I know how, well, I couldn't tell you how many times I've had suspicious looks or even very concerned looks from people, or people chasing after me, wondering what the hell I'm doing in the neighbourhood, looking a bit suspicious. When I tell them that it's all good fun frogging activity, they're usually happy. But yeah, look, if you want to access a site that you think might be private property, so probably best to find out whose property it is and get permission. Always tell someone where you're going, particularly if you're going out at night. And one thing I do want to say is if you're frogging at night using FrogID from out of your car, just be really careful where you're parking off the side of the road if there's a lot of traffic around, etc. I think that's one of the important sort of safety issues when you're using FrogID. Where, as you've probably heard about elsewhere and also from what Jodie was talking about, one of the big problems for our frogs is pathogens that get spread around the landscape. So generally we try to use pretty clean hygiene protocols of always maintaining clean boots. But in particular, we're very careful when we handle frogs. And so you can't actually get a scientific license to work with frogs without agreeing to use very strict hygiene protocols such as wearing gloves and so forth. But just be mindful of the fact that one of the big problems for frogs is the spreading of pathogens. And so we try to reduce the possibility that through our activities that might happen. And of course, with current COVID, the current COVID situation, stick to the guidelines in terms of where you can go and who you can go with and distancing, etc. So look, one of the great things, and some of this is sort of going back over what you've already heard. One of the things about surveying for a frog is that to survey for one, you really need to know them all, and you really need to know what different species you're listening to. And I can't see, it was there. Tell me if you can hear this, Helen. Clearly not.
No.
No, it's a bit odd because earlier my share.
You might have to make the calls, Dave.
Think you do.
Sounds like I will.
We thought this might happen.
That's right.
Be back.
All right. So anyway, you heard earlier that you know, the way FrogID works is that you're listening for the calls. I think I've moved forward unintentionally. I wanted to go back, which it's not letting me do.
Just click on the page and move back, maybe.
Oh, there it goes.
There you
Yep.
go.
So look, so it's actually more difficult than it sounds. So for example, with Sloan's Froglet, each year when Helen and I go out to start our Sloan's surveys, you actually do need to recalibrate your ear for Sloan's. And in particular, this little guy, Plains Froglet, just next to Sloan's here in the photos, depending on what Plains Froglet's doing, and in particular, depending on the temperature, can sound very similar to Sloan's. And we've had lots and lots of people excitedly telling us how they've found, you know, the greatest new Sloan's population, only to then hear a recording of a loud Plains Froglet colony. And in fact, I've actually had a lot of expert consultants do just this, which is one of the reasons why I've pushed very hard in our agency that a requirement of undertaking a fauna impact assessment surveying for targeted frog species is that they use FrogID. This is just yet another fantastic application of the FrogID, is that you're not only having experts check the calls that are in the recordings, but Jodie then has that recording that's archived and is a reference point that we can go back to if we want to query the identification or query some other aspect of the situation. So this little guy here, Plains Froglet, is definitely the Sloan's mimic. And I mentioned temperature before, and this is one of the really interesting things with frogs. So you have the standard advertisement call for frogs. So in the case of Sloan's Froglet, it's and then the standard advertisement call for Plains Froglet, which is But frog calls are very influenced, because they're a cold-blooded animal. The characteristic of the frog call is very influenced by the temperature of the frog at that particular point in time. And so, for example, Plains Froglet, which will often call in summer when it's really warm, all of a sudden becomes this sharp which sounds a bit like So there are lots of misidentifications of Sloane's froglet because of people hearing plains froglet when the little plains froglet is really warm. And so anyway, that's just an example of one reason why you need to become really familiar, intimately familiar with the frog's calls and their variation. The other thing too is we've been talking a lot about the advertisement call of frogs, but that's not the only call that frogs make. Frogs, particularly male frogs, also give a aggression call, or they might also give a threat call. But so for example, the advertisement call of plains froglet is a ee. But the males, when they're trying to sort out their territory and sort of biff onto other males, give a eh, eh, eh. So it's a eh, calling out to the females, and then a eh, 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 telling other males to bugger off. And again, we often get people saying, oh, we've got Sloanes here, I've got a recording, and there'll just be this loud ongoing chorus of plains froglet, and then all of a sudden at some point there'll be a and they'll be like, there it is. It's like, well, actually, no, that's just a pissed off plains froglet telling another male to bugger off. And the other thing too is being intimate with the calls. The other challenge there is picking the calls out amongst the chorus of lots of different calls. And once you start doing this, and you know, for those who regularly go out and listen to frog choruses and try and pick the different ones out, it's amazing how you'll be in a spot, you'll hear this loud chorus of different frog calls, and you've then got to work your ears into working in that narrow range of the Sloane's froglet call. And your brain won't pick up Sloane's froglet until you somehow sort of work it into that right sort of listening sort of frame. And then all of a sudden it's like, there it is. It was there all along, but it took me a while to pick it out from amongst the loud chorus of all the other frogs. And anyway, Helen has already played a lot of these frogs for you. There's some interesting ones in amongst here. The Bibron's toadlet. Jodie's talked about describing new species using FrogID and other work that she's doing. Bibron's toadlet is a local species that is currently under taxonomic review. There's every likelihood that the Bibron's toadlet found around the Albury area and going through down into Wodonga and surrounds is going to be more restricted than we currently realise, and may even possibly also be a species warranting listing as threatened. And so this is another good example of where using FrogID, getting information now on Bibron's toadlet is going to help us, should in the event that this species becomes listed, help us better understand what's the current status, where is it, and just using all the different techniques that Jodie talked about earlier, start to understand what its habitat and conservation requirements are. So I'm going to finish up there, and again just acknowledge all the different partners that are involved in this. It really is, this is a fantastic project. This is the one threatened species project that I'm involved in, where involving the community, the fate of Sloane's froglet really does rely on the broader community. We've seen through Karen's work and the map that was shown about how Sloane's is dotted right through the urban environment in Wodonga, and we've heard Jodie talk about how frogs don't necessarily persist in landscapes that have been highly modified by humans. But she then also made the point, and Glenn also made this point, we can have species like Sloane's froglet persist in areas that we're living, but it just requires us to understand their requirements and cater to it, ensure that the right sort of wetlands and connectivity across the landscape persists. And I believe we can do it, but it's not going to happen without everyone's help. And I'll finish there. Thank you.